A few days after my last video on asylums, this came out.
We are told that this Hudson River State Hospital was constructed in just 3 years.
And it took all of 3 seconds to find that the built in 3 years thing was not true. The Tartaria Old World Reset bros just won't let go of their claims about the 1800s insane asylums. This was presented to me as having the good research on the topic.
Once the new powers had taken over after the reset, they used these asylums to quarantine, confine, and deal with all the people who weren't going to integrate into the new society. Potentially also used as, dare I say, extermination centers.
He dares to say it. Very big claim. Very serious claim. Actually, there's a lot of archaeology about this, which is not what you'd do if you wanted to keep secret the fact that these were mass graves for Tartaria Empire memory keepers.
Independence Hospital in Iowa, you really can't find any record of construction or the architect.
The way that is said, like the most dishonest thing in the whole video. There absolutely is a record of construction and an architect. How did they do this with horse and buggy? They lived in a shack. Cowboys couldn't build this. They paid $1,000 for a steam engine. This is what finding the receipts looks like. This is what you have to do before you have any credibility when making a claim.
They originally didn't have a railroad going to Cherokee.
What do you mean by originally? The Stone Age? This asylum opened in 1902. Iowa has some railroads going through it. They've got no other way to explain society's old world amnesia, and they have zero evidence for their asylum theory. Join me for the real research, and open your eyes to the ways these Tartaria channels lie. All right, guys, welcome back to Inner World. This is going to be a bit of a different show. I've got so much to cover that I have to present this stuff solo. Like 15,000 words of notes in my research, over 150 images. So if we're going to finish off this asylum topic once and for all, and really more importantly than that, give you the anatomy of what the Tartaria reset genre is like whenever you start to investigate their claims, I got to do it by myself. So it's not to exclude Dylan. It's just to get it out there, get it done, get it on the record. We have lots to cover. Now, actually, this is the second time I've begun a recording of this project. So I want to be upfront about something before we start. This stuff kind of annoys me, okay? And I'm a nice guy. So when I first was putting my notes together to talk about what we're going to talk about today, every time I would come up against something that was dishonest or seemed potentially intentionally misleading, I was getting a little ticked off. And I was kind of putting that into my notes, a little bit of tongue in cheek, a little bit of righteous indignation. And once I finished off the whole project, I decided to do a pass of revisions to try to neutralize all of that and make it as academic as possible. And so in my notes, it is like that now. It's very neutral. I never was going out to attack anybody specifically. But what happened was I had a real life biofield consequence of repressing my authentic feelings on the topic. As in, I started working on this, the recording of this, and I woke up the next day with a super stiff and painful back right neck and upper back right shoulder, which is exactly the biofield area for whenever you've got anger or maybe assertiveness that is felt but not expressed. So when I realized that, I had an epiphany later in the day, and my neck started feeling dramatically better all of a sudden, and it had been getting worse. And on top of that, just my fire to do this subject really was powerful and strong. And then once I stripped out my feelings from the topic, which are legitimate and valid feelings that I think would be weird to not include, I had very little motivation or enthusiasm for it. So as we get into this topic, I might get a little cheeky about some of the stuff we're looking at. And that's just me responding to how I really feel about it. And I'm doing my best to be authentic and to be professional and not ad hominem, because that's what people in this genre have been doing to me. I think that's part of what gives me some anger reaction, which is, I'm sure, totally normal. So I just wanted to put all that on up front so that if If I get a little scathing, it's natural. So my last project on the asylum topic, we exposed the bad research template of the typical Tartaria reset content by examining a John Levi video and an article on a website called Tartaria Britannica. You can go find that on my channel. And we looked at a couple of very interesting asylums in that one. But maybe the last word on the subject had not been reached. I was actually sent another YouTube channel who did an episode about this topic. The channel is called Lucius Aurelian. And this was presented to me as having the good research on the topic. I thought that probably anything would be better than the kind of meandering thing that John Levi did on the Utah Asylum as we covered it. And in fairness, I ought to check it out and see if there's anything that I missed that might help me change my mind on the reset narrative question regarding the 19th century insane asylums. So this is the video we're going to be considering today. It's called Asylums, Kirkbride's Dream. It's by Lucius Aurelian. That is the name of the YouTube channel. It's going to be linked to my show notes. You can go watch this if you want. It's a 72-minute video, but it's a live stream, so there's a lot of banter with his chat. But about 1/3 of it actually does contain serious claims or implications that are couched in the guise of just incredulous questioning. So we're going to focus on chasing down as many of the leads in this as we can. And I mean as many as we can. It's going to be quite thorough. But it's also going to demonstrate to you exactly what is wrong with the genre of Tartaria reset content. And if this is something that is ubiquitous to this content, and as far as I have been able to tell, it absolutely is, then maybe we can put this down. Maybe we'll look at a couple of more things about it that are interesting, like how they actually build stuff, or the Antiquitech question, things like that. I think it would be fun to do a talk about the dirigibles and airships of that era. So I don't know anything about this Lucius guy, apart from this one video. And he just basically appears to be a typical Tartaria reset genre creator. And he does have a better presentation of more sources than John Levi. But as we'll see, he twists the way that he presents these resources, if you will, and it just falls apart. The very first thing you look at and everything afterwards, it all falls apart. And I'm going to show you exactly what that looks like. In the process, you'll see what is really required to research this type of information from a authentic historical perspective. I do not have any particular attachment to the outcome of investigating Tartaria and the reset theory other than to get to the truth of things. So if that actually means I got to accept legitimate observations from Lucius, I'm super happy to do that. Or from anybody that wants to present me good evidence or real evidence of the theory. But if the investigation totally debunks his position and demonstrates somebody being dishonest or lazy in their research, or however this shakes out from your perspective, I challenge you to accept that outcome. Okay? In the future, I will say this again, and I have said it in the past. The burden of proof is on the one making the claims. And these big claims about the lost Tartarian civilization are on the people making the claims to prove that. Okay? All we're really here to do is see if we can falsify the claims that they're made. Falsifying claims does not automatically produce an alternative, sweeping narrative explanation of reality that is satisfactory or contrarian to mainstream history. And I've been recently accused of just reading history books and regurgitating them. So I'll be clear again that my target for this investigation was primary sources and very few actual history books. Primary sources meaning first-hand accounts from real people, documents that survive from the era, things like that. And so if these primary sources converge to a coherent historical narrative with one another, then that is what it is. And then the only thing left for Tartaria reset theory is that all of these primary sources were fabricated and forged and placed all around the country and even all around the world in libraries and archives just to trick people in the future who have the internet so that they wouldn't catch on to Tartaria. Come on. Come on. Now, the last thing before we kick off, my good friend Gabe, also known as Slick Dissident, you know him, you love him. He shared some wise words with me. He said, "Beware the joy of unworthy enemies. Straw manning is not inferior to steel manning merely because it is common or gregarious, but rather more so because its promise of discomfort ensures innovation." That really stuck with me as I did this research because, like I said, I was getting annoyed and kind of wanting to attack the messenger for being whatever he turns out to be. Somebody that doesn't even put his real name or his face to the research. But that makes it really hard to see things from the other side's perspective. So I'm going to do my best to give them the benefit of the doubt and even try to improve Lucius's argument to the strongest potential I can before I address it. That's called steel manning. So that should prove that I'm not straw manning him. I'm actually trying to make his claim better where I can and even show things that he doesn't show that could support his idea. And then we'll discuss whether or not that idea holds water. I hope in the process you see some innovation in your insight emerge and that, it's healthy to change your mind about stuff. If you don't change your mind, I don't care. That's fine too. I'm just doing this really for me. I wanted to know. And for anyone that wants to come on the journey with me. And for the record, even though that quote from Gabe refers to the joy of unworthy enemies, I do not consider Tartaria or Reset people to be my enemies. We ought to be on the same side, which is the side of truth. So if that's the side you're on, why don't you come along with me on this research journey as we look at Lucius's video and consider the claims. Okay, so we're going to look at clips from his video that contain the claims. Here's the first one.
What were the asylums originally? Potentially, they were originally resorts for the original civilization, and then I believe they were converted to be sanctuaries to survive whatever terrible event happened. Once the new powers had taken over after the reset, they used these asylums to quarantine, confine, and deal with all the people who weren't going to integrate into the new society.
All right, let's get this one out of the way first. This is the biggest claim that reset theory makes about the asylums. And when you challenge these guys with the evidence that these insane asylum facilities were actually built by 19th century Americans, they will retreat to saying that even if they were, it doesn't matter because there's so much other evidence for the reset. But when they're talking to their followers, like in this live stream, they will keep on saying the same thing. The asylums were used to quarantine and indoctrinate the people who wouldn't get with the program, those who remembered and spoke about the lost old world. But you can't have it both ways. Either these asylums are not important enough to the theory to matter when they're scrutinized, or they're very important to the theory as the main way, as far as I've heard, to explain how and why the public memory of this lost civilization could have possibly been erased from everybody's mind. He also front-loads his claim with potentially, and then goes on to act like it's a proven statement, which is the Mott and Bailey fallacy I talk about all the time with this genre. As far as the whole they used to be resorts or sanctuaries, well, that one doesn't need to be addressed directly because if you can prove that 19th century people built them, then that is all taken away. And I think the only reason that they believe that asylums used to be sanctuaries for the old world is because asylum itself, the word means sanctuary. And they love to say that the Tartaria hiding elites are playing with words whenever they call something a thing. This is Fergus Falls. It is a state hospital in Minnesota. And the Minnesota Historic Property Record, Fergus Falls State Hospital, is a document that contains a ton of information about this. Construction begins in 1888 and goes on all the way to 1912. I have the document linked in my show notes, and it has citations to things in archives that talk about everything from the process of building it to the treatments that evolved over its existence and all kinds of other stuff. Here is an image that shows an illustration of the detached west building, the first structure that is said to be erected at the Fergus Falls Hospital. And then you have the asylum as it appeared in 1906, and they had not yet completed the central tower. This is actually a photograph here. See that middle part? Let me zoom in. Okay. We have these two turret-looking things, and then a unfinished middle tower. Oh, here we go. 1910. The tower is complete. We see construction photos. These are actual photographs. And then we have the Territorial Insane Asylum we looked at last time from Utah. It was completed in 1891, but there's the partially built asylum from 1888 in this photo. As you can see, this is just the right-hand side of the building that you see in the completion photo. They often built the asylums in stages like this, and a lot of them have photographic record of the stages of the construction. And then there's the Buffalo State Asylum, which is still standing today, called the Richardson Olmsted Complex. I talked about this in my last video in more detail, but I didn't have this photo at that time. The heavily documented build of this particular asylum happened in phases from 1871 to 1896. It opened in 1880, 16 years before it was even completed. There was a 10-year construction halt that happened during an economic depression. This 1880 photo, when only the east wing of the asylum had been completed, I couldn't find last time, but this time I found it using the Wayback Machine because the URL to this image was 404. They're trying to hide the evidence that it was not Tartaria. But I found it. Here's the completed building. So you can see before, this main central structure only has one wing coming off of it. After, two wings coming off of it. Did they ever show you this in the Tartaria videos? As you can see, this is a Batwing style Kirkbride building like dozens of others. Two wings, and they had not built the second one in 1880. And there may not be a ton of easily accessible digitized photos that show these phases of construction for all of the many buildings across the country, but we're talking about stuff built between 1850 and 1900. Only the stuff in the tail end of that time frame is probably going to have any photographic documentation at all. And it's not guaranteed that if it survived, it was digitized or that it survived, because very few people probably ever cared to go digging in physical county or state archives for this stuff to put it online. Not weird. That's actually typical for historical archives.
Asylums were simply re-education centers, or even what they would call concentration camps, a place to run people off and keep them out of the way of society. And you know, if they could reintegrate, which it seemed like very few could. I mean, once you went to the asylum, you weren't coming out of there. And really, that's the story that we have.
Okay, that's really that's the story that we have. Okay, we have that story from you and people like you, but I don't have that story from anywhere else. Lucius is waving off the idea, no, it's not a place to go and recover. It's these authorities, the Tartaria suppressing elites are playing games with words. So he also has actually floated the idea in this video that these were potentially extermination centers, which we're going to get to in a bit. The implied claim is that the recovery of insane people in these buildings was a cover story. That is very easily testable. And so I found many stories from the period that demonstrate people getting out of the asylum. They were there for legitimate reasons. You have alcoholics and drug abusers were typically there for about 3 months, not unlike modern rehab centers. People wrote about their experiences, so the story is not just coming from the authorities, unless what? They're fake accounts? All the accounts are fake. Everything that disagrees with my position is forged. But let's just get logical for a second here. Between 1850 and 1900, the U.S. population went from a middle 20 million to over 70 million. 50 years. 50 million larger population. A lot of people coming into the country. The reset theory would imply that of all those 20 million in 1850, the dozen or so asylums that were operational in the United States at that time, because there were only about a dozen in 1850, those would have been enough to contain all the people who remembered this old world civilization or who would talk about it. And these are the people that are closer to it in history if it was real. Let's do the math. And let's be generous about the math, because like I said, there's only about 12 asylums in the country at this time. But let's just say there's 15 asylums holding 2,000 people each, which, by the way, almost none of them had that kind of capacity. At the time of 1850, probably none of them could hold that many people. But we're being generous here. It's a steel man. So that ballpark figure gets us to 30,000 people, 2,000 times 15 asylums. Out of 20 million, that is 0.15%. 15% of 1%, okay? That's how many people were in an asylum. And it's actually less than that. Census figures estimate the number at that time of people who were institutionalized as being between 2,000 and 5,000 total, meaning, according to the census, if it's real, or closer to reality, a reasonable estimate of institutionalized population by percentage is actually 2% of 1%, 0.025. That's 2.5% of 1%, very small. By 1890, 40 years later, the figure grew to about 74,000 institutionalized people nationwide. That provokes a legit question. Why were so many more people in need of mental health care? Great question. Industrialization, urbanization, these are obvious culprits. Things were changing a lot during this time period. But also the change in philosophy that shifted responsibility on this issue away from church and family and towards the state and private doctors. That would greatly change the situation of institutional numbers. The whole point of the Kirkbride plan that brought about all of these asylums throughout the country, and the point of the doctor's ideology that led to Kirkbride writing his book, the idea was to get insane people away from being chained to the wall in jail basements. 74,000 insane patients out of 62 million people in 1890 United States, still a much larger number of patients compared to before, and it's still just 0.12% of the total population, 12% of 1%. So the bigger picture, the U.S. grew from 5 million people in 1800 to 63 million by 1890. That is a 12-fold increase. Just having a lot of kids does not account for that. Of course, there's a lot of immigration. So maybe that's their explanation, that the immigrants didn't know about Tartaria because they weren't from here. I'm not sure. But theoretically, Tartaria was worldwide, so wouldn't they know about it potentially too? Now, the thing about the asylums at this age is they were the catch-all for people that were just a problem in some way or couldn't be cared for. You have senile folks, dementia cases, epilepsy, alcoholism, intellectually disabled, and late-stage syphilis. That makes people crazy too. They all landed in the same building because no other public institution would take them. And at the time when folks were now doing factory work in a city, they can't take care of their family members the way a farmhouse could. And these numbers keep growing year over year because even if a hospital could discharge half of its patients in a year, the other half get added the next year to whoever else is getting admitted. And that just keeps stacking year after year. The whole concentration camp theory never talks about these kind of numbers. Why would you need to lock up 0.1% of the population or less? Wouldn't a lot more people than that have a problematically good memory of the old world? Could you just write off that tiny minority's belief as inconsequential anyway, if it was really such a small number as were in the asylums? And what did they do with the actual crazy people that needed an institution? If these were only for Tartaria rememberers, where did all the actual insane people go to get taken care of? It just falls apart on basic scrutiny. I mean, we should just end it there. Hang up the phone. But there's so much more that we can falsify about what Lucius and the genre says. And I'm not saying that the asylums were perfect. Bad things happened in places like this. It's just not the Tartaria reset suppression things that were happening. There was involuntary committal to asylums. The standards were way looser than modern times. People genuinely sometimes went in and never came out. Sometimes they wound up in a mass graveyard on the property with little more than an unmarked stone or a piece of wood as their grave marker. That's real. I'm not pretending that it's all roses, but my goal here is not to make out the institutions to be all good. It's just to answer the question as to whether they were treatment institutions that were really built by 19th century America or death camps in disguise. And again, the real goal behind this is to just show you how bad the genre is at how bad it is at everything. It's so silly. They're all like this. This is good old Mr. Pliny Earl. And I just love his name. He sounds so highfalutin and educated, named Pliny, but then you have that sort of hick second half of Earl. And what an awesome chin strap the dude has. Total legend. Pliny here, he was half a year younger than Thomas Kirkbride. Kirkbride is the guy that gets the historical credit for the asylums, But Pliny was equally crucial to the development of the idea that created the asylums, which is called environmental determinism or moral treatment, which, as I said in the previous episode, that's literally terrain medicine. This guy wrote, works include A Visit to 13 Asylums for the Insane in Europe, Institutions for the Insane in Prussia, Austria, and Germany, and the one we're going to look at right now, The Curability of Insanity. He wrote other stuff too. He took a tour of asylums in Europe, and that was for sure influential on Kirkbride and the other founding members of the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. I'm only going to say that once. That's AMSAII. That's the group of alienists, they called themselves. They didn't call themselves psychiatrists. They called themselves alienists, because being insane alienates you from society, and also the cure, they thought, was to keep you away from all the other people. So I've got some pages here. I looked at his book, The Curability of Insanity, and it gives very hard institutional statistics on patient recovery rates. He even talks about how the statistics are skewed by the fact that some people go in and come out and go in and come out multiple times. So this guy was a legit critic of his own field. Not that he disliked his field, he was just being as careful and meticulous as possible to show whether or not they were succeeding at their goal. He wrote this book near the end of his life, and from what I could tell, reading the pages that were about this topic and the hard numbers, like almost half of everyone treated in these asylums walked out of there for good. Unless Mr. Earl is lying, which I guess I can't know, but there are actually reports and accounting documentation from individual asylums. If someone wanted to get crazy, they could cross-reference Pliny's book against the institutional records. It's very detailed stuff, and there's a lot of institutions. And then you have this book. It's actually a journal, The Alienist and Neurologist, a quarterly journal. And there's an article in this journal called Hospitals for the Insane Viewed from the Standpoint of Personal Experience by a Recovered Patient. One Janet Roots Rees, a recovered patient formerly cared for in the State Asylum for the Insane at Morristown, New Jersey. She wrote, "One of the most encouraging features of our civilization is its growing humanitarianism, and prominent amongst many such indications is an increased interest in the fate of the insane. Mental disease is no longer a crime in the eyes of intelligent people, and cases in which an afflicted person is cruelly used because wanting, and chained up, beaten, and starved are very rare. The light of publicity throws our insane asylums open to the criticism of the benevolent, and a marked change for the better is evident in their management. A residence of over 2 years in an institution which is generally recognized as one of, if not the best in the world, has qualified me to offer an opinion." Now, there's an actual larger memoir of these kind of accounts held by Kent State University in the Insane Asylum Memoirs, an 1842 to 1890 collection. There are many, many first-hand accounts in this collection, and they vary from singing the praises of the doctors for helping them to get better to exposing horrific mistreatment and abuse. I found a lot more than I'm going to cover because it just would take too long. The point is, I found a lot of evidence that people got out. So when Lucius just told us in the last clip, you check, crazies check in, but they don't check out, or whatever he said. That's not what he said, but essentially, you go in and you never get out. That's just not true. Sorry, you are lying, or you never bothered to check. What I found is that the whole spectrum of light and dark was at play in these institutions, just as it is in all places of the world. But in these first-hand accounts, I could not find anything mentioning Tartaria or the persecution of the memory keepers of the old world.
There's a much more ominous tone with these asylums. So not only are they just used to quarantine people, if you will, or confine people, but they're potentially also used as, dare I say, extermination centers, because you have large cemeteries around every one of these.
Dare I say it? He dares to say it. That large cemeteries equals extermination centers. That is a very big claim. Very serious claim. Since we've already addressed the first part of this theory, that these were concentration camps for Tartaria memory keepers, and that didn't hold up, let's look at this one by the numbers. Okay, so the asylum that he was showing here is the Milledgeville, Georgia Asylum. It opened in 1842, and it was one of the earliest of its kind. It was not a true Kirkbride, because Kirkbride did not publish his book until 12 years later. But as you can see, the trend was already underway to build large asylums outside of heavily urbanized areas, not directly in the city. This building was in use from 1842 all the way to 2010, 168 years of institutional operation, which is a really long time. What else does Lucius say about Milledgeville and the big graveyard here?
They really stated that 25,000 people, and who knows how many, died there and are buried on the ground. So right off the bat, you already have suspicion of something crazy going on.
Yeah, suspicion of something crazy going on in an insane asylum. I think crazy is by definition what's going on there, but I joke. He gets the number right, according to the state of Georgia itself, in their official announcements or documentation about this graveyard, 25,000, which seems horrific. That does sound like a Holocaust, but I think Lucius is actually right to see a number like that and a graveyard like that and ask questions. But can we find an answer that will satisfy the explanation? Let's do the math real quick. 25,000 deaths over 168 years of operation averages to about 148.8 per year, 150 a year. Let's just round it up. By the 1960s, this was actually the world's largest mental health institution with over 12,000 patients and 6,000 employees and over 8,000 acres of land. Humongous. The cemetery kept growing for almost the entire span of time that the asylum was operational. And keep in mind, many people with mental illness have physical illness too, and are very, very poor people who've had a really rough life, and many that are institutionalized until death are without families. So where are they going to get buried? Who's going to pay for it? So seeing a big cemetery like this could be very spooky at first, I get it, but 168 years is a really long time to be hosting sick and dying patients, of whom a large percentage might not even have the means for a proper burial elsewhere. So even though, right, your first impression is, holy crap, that is crazy, I'm not convinced it's suspicious. Here's a picture of the Milledgeville graveyard, and, you know, obviously it's bigger than this if we're talking 25,000, but this is kind of the gist of how it appears.
Keep in mind, the population of Milledgeville in Georgia is not that it's not that large. I think it's only about 16,000.
Okay, so he's saying the population of Milledgeville currently is about 16,000. That is true. And you'd think, wow, 25,000 people in a graveyard of a city that's only 16,000 right now, that's crazy. But what you might not know, I didn't know, I'm not from Georgia, Milledgeville was the state capital of Georgia all the way from 1807 to 1868 before it got moved to Atlanta. So for the first 26 years of this asylum's history, it was a capital city institution serving as the centralized location for the entire state service of mental health care. They got a railroad in 1853. The current size of Milledgeville, in my opinion, doesn't really have any real weight as an argument for the extermination theory. Lucius also later brings up the Milwaukee Soldiers Asylum as his backup proof of the theory, which is called the Wood National Cemetery, another very large soldiers' cemetery with tombstones going back to the Revolutionary War. I don't think that's evidence of his theory either. I mean, we're talking about a soldiers' cemetery, and soldiers often come back from war with mental health problems, nobody to look after them. They enlisted because they had nowhere else to go, things like that. He does mention experimentation and abuse at asylums, like eugenics experiments and all kinds of horrifying stuff. And of course, that's true. The institutional records admit that stuff, but it's not concealed. And it's not a Tartaria extermination program. Bad behavior on the record from psychiatrists later in the century has nothing to do with the Tartaria memory keeper extermination program. Now, Anyone that looks into this idea further of mass graves, like I did, will find that Lucius doesn't mention how common mass graves are at these sites. And it's actually much more intense than he shows here with this single, or I guess 2 examples of Milwaukee and Milledgeville. I'm talking about huge fields of numbered iron stakes, tens of thousands of anonymous dead bodies in the ground. So when Lucius calls these places extermination centers and shows you a cemetery, he's actually pointing at, I think, the most emotionally powerful evidence, if we could call it evidence, in his entire case. So let's not brush it off and move on. Let's steelman it. Let's show you how much more there is than what he showed and whether or not we find it suspicious. So after I saw this segment in his video, I wanted to find out if there were more like it. I at first kind of thought I was just going to hear like urban legends and rumors, campfire ghost stories, but actually there's a lot of archaeology about this. At the Mississippi State Lunatic Asylum in Jackson, construction crews for what is now the University of Mississippi Medical Center found coffins in the 90s, and then 66 more in 2012, and then over 1,000 more in 2014, leading them to do ground-penetrating radar, where they estimate that as many as 7,000 bodies are strewn across about 20 acres. Here's a photo of that. The archaeology. And then in New York, the state's own estimate is that around 55,000 former patients lie in anonymous graves statewide. And I'm not sure if that number applies to just hospitals or mental health hospitals only. They did have some big ones there. And they did specifically give a number of 5,800 at the Willard Asylum in New York. This is Hart Island, New York. So archaeologists have been checking out these mass graves at hospitals all around the country, which is not what you'd do if you wanted to keep secret the fact that these were mass graves for Tartaria Empire memory keepers, right? You would just keep it hush-hush, wouldn't you? I don't know. And then there's the Territorial Insane Asylum in Utah. Here's a picture of the marker that they put up there. We only see 485 patients buried without grave markers at the Provo City Cemetery in Utah. But here's what the evidence actually shows about how those people came to be in the ground. We'll start with the numbered markers. Rows upon rows of iron stakes marked with numbers instead of names, which was apparently actually standard practice for institutional poor people burials across the country in the 19th century, and maybe even into the 20th century. At Milledgeville, specifically, we know exactly why the cemetery became anonymous, the one that Lucius was showing. The graves were marked with the numbered iron poles, and in the 60s, there were prison inmates assigned to groundskeeping duty, and they pulled up thousands of these markers and threw them into the woods without recording where they had stood. It wasn't like they were intentionally covering it up. They just were a chronically underfunded and overstrained institution that couldn't be bothered to protect that graveyard. And Mississippi tells a similar story with even better documentation. The researchers explained that the graves were marked originally, mostly with painted wooden stakes, and because of the climate in Mississippi, which is very hot and wet, the wood just rotted over the better part of a century. And there you go. You have unmarked graves. As you can see in this photo here, they're discovering that these graves are in coffins laid out in orderly rows, buried with as much respect as you could afford to give a familyless poor person in that era. The Mississippi State Archive actually still has the admission and death records. And there's a documentary they made about this site that states that the archives reveal why many were admitted and how they died. Again, a regime running secret death camps to erase the memory of a lost civilization probably doesn't carefully file paperwork and leave it in the state archives for a century. You would think they would want to destroy those records, but the institutions keep them. And when the researchers examine the remains themselves, they're coming back with the exact type of stuff that you would expect to see for poverty in that era, mostly nutritional deficiency related diseases like pellagra, which is a niacin deficiency that comes from eating almost only corn. Poor guys, man. And that apparently creates dementia-like symptoms. Then you have syphilis, which makes people crazy. I think syphilis is probably a similar like neglect, malnutrition type thing rather than a sexually transmitted disease. So everything that overcrowding of poor people in a public institution would lead you to do, I think, and the kind of deaths that you would expect are being found there, but I don't think there's any evidence of just outright extermination or murder. Maybe there were some murders. Maybe there was some shady stuff that happened. That's most likely true, but it's just not what is being claimed here. So, to give it its due, if you were watching this Lucius video and you saw this big graveyard and you had the feeling something terrible happened in these places, that's probably correct. Terrible things happened. There were people committed on thin evidence. They were warehoused as numbers rather than names whenever the overcrowding got super bad. And the entire therapeutic idea that these buildings were designed around, which was to have a nice amount of space and not be crowded and give them a good environment so that they could get better, that just totally fell by the wayside because of how crowded things got. And essentially, that was part of the death knell of terrain medicine as it applied to mental health care. And they started trying other stuff like drugs and electric shock therapy. So we know about this because the graves are being dug up, cataloged, and even memorialized by universities and state legislators. That is not a hidden extermination cover-up, guys. And now we need to get into the good doctor himself, Thomas Kirkbride. Before we get into him, let's review. In my other asylum video, there's a big segment you might not have seen because it was behind the paywall where we talked more about Kirkbride and his plan and how the whole thing was rooted in terrain ideology rather than contagion and other forms of later medical ideology. They called it environmental determinism. Your environment creates the conditions for your health. It's actually really cool. So in order for the rest of the breakdown of this section to make sense, I got to catch you up to speed or give you a review, depending on if you saw it or not, on this historical character, Thomas Story Kirkbride, who was the central guy in the historical narrative around the 19th century asylums. His name, Dr. Thomas Story Kirkbride. And I'll talk about the middle name being Story in just a minute, but let's recap who the guy was and what his role is in the creation of the infamous Kirkbride asylums that we've been looking at. The accepted standard history of Kirkbride was that he was a Philadelphia Quaker and physician who was born in 1809. He received a medical degree from the University of Pennsylvania in 1832. He was then a resident physician at the Progressive Friends Asylum for the Insane, because Quakers call their organization the Friends. And this was originally called, and I love the way they titled stuff back then, the Asylum for the Relief of Persons Deprived of the Use of Their Reason. I love that. This is said to be the first private mental health care facility in the entire country, operated by Quakers, and it was more charity at first than hospital. Here is a photo, or not a photo of a drawing of the Friends Asylum for the Insane. And here's what it looks like more in modern times. So in 1841, there was overcrowding in other state facilities, and it was said to have been the reason that they constructed the Pennsylvania Hospital for the Insane, where Kirkbride became the first superintendent and remained in that chair for over 40 years until his death in 1883. Now, because of the high population of Quakers in Pennsylvania and their charitable nature, this is why Pennsylvania became one of the trailblazers in this whole asylum reform movement. Kirkbride is important to the asylums because he was both one of the founding members of the AMSAII, the Association of Medical Superintendents of American Institutions for the Insane. He literally wrote the book on the philosophy and actual blueprint of these asylums, and it's called On the Construction, Organization, and General Arrangements of Hospitals for the Insane. This is from 1854. Now, if you look at this, I'll zoom in so you can see it a little better. But you have everything accounted for. You've got amount of land, how to choose a site for it, how to appoint the building commissioners, how to generally form and arrange the building, the materials to use, how to make it fireproof, how to do the door locks and the window guards and everything. I mean, it just goes on and on, down to describing how to do urinals. So it was a very thorough book. The next page of the table of contents tells you more. how much it should probably cost. There's in the appendixes even more information, including there's drawings and plans for the general layout that most states actually adopted whenever they started these hospitals. And here is what that general layout looks like. They call it the Batwing plan or the V shape. And we'll talk about more why this layout was important. But right now it has to be said again and again, because what people come at me with whenever they're upset that I'm covering this is that, in a nutshell, every piece of evidence from the historical record that disagrees with their Tartaria reset position must be fake or a forgery. But that's just denial. That doesn't hold up in reality. This book physically exists in medical libraries and archives around the country since 1854. It's widely referenced in other writing, in journals, and in other books. They talk about Kirkbride in all kinds of state legislature meetings where the minutes and the happenings of the legislature are recorded under oath. So this is the blueprint that dozens of hospitals, like 70 plus hospitals, copied or altered in some way, but were influenced by. And his influence with the wider community of alienists, as they were called at the time, not psychiatrists, is really easy to track down. He had membership in a bunch of organizations like the one I just mentioned, AMSAII, which is now the American Psychiatric Association, the APA. By the way, I'm not saying that the APA is a good thing or that it's always been honest and that it has no corruption. Of course, mainstream psychiatry has become corrupt, but that doesn't take away the existence of this book, the ideology behind it, or the many, many primary sources all around the country, even around the world, that discussed this book, implemented its recommendations, and maybe even debated whether or not it was a good idea. So if you want more of a full presentation about that, including the dissent that I found on the historical record to the Kirkbride plan, check out the back half of my more recent episode about it. The first one I did on insane asylums. It's linked in the notes here. All right, let's see what Lucius has to say about Kirkbride.
All right, so Thomas Story Kirkbride, and this is one of those old-style photographs. They didn't necessarily call it a photograph, but a daguerreotype, or just some strange excuse for why they don't have a good photo. Mr. Kirkbride was alive from 1809 to 1883.
All right, so this is one of those moments where I'm like, are you kidding me, dude? So he shows this super blurry photo. He says it's suspicious that they don't have a good photo, or at least implies it. Then he names the type of photography, the daguerreotype, and then he explains that Kirkbride lived in the era of that sort of photography. He gives the era of Kirkbride's lifetime. So naming the technology that explains the photo that was just claimed as suspicious is called self-defeat. And to be fair, expecting good photos of a man who is famous up into the 1880s is reasonable, and some of those photos exist. The only thing missing is earlier photos, which is exactly what the invention for photography, the date that it was invented, would predict. The daguerreotype was invented in 1839, so no photos of Kirkbride could possibly exist before he's 30 years old. The process gets refined in the mid-1850s, so a blurry early photo of a man in his 30s or 40s labeled as Kirkbride, that makes sense. And that's exactly what this photo that he shows would suggest, that age. But if you watch the video, minutes after saying the daguerreotype was a strange excuse for why they don't have a good photo, he shows these photos that are from a later time and they're better. He says nothing again about the no good photo statement. So are you kidding? Like, this is what they do. It's not exclusive to this guy, Lucius. It's like the whole genre. They say, this is weird and suspicious and unexplained. And then they show you or tell you exactly what explains it and never point out that they just defeated their own presumption themselves. What else does he have to say about it?
What's intriguing, though, about good old Mr. Kirkbride is the fact that while he may have been a well-reputed psychiatrist and a physician at the time, it's really interesting when you look at his biography. His involvement with the Kirkbride plan seems to be a little, well, should we say, ambiguous at best, which I know at this point we're not really surprised when it comes to the 19th century.
This is just absurd. I don't know what biography he's talking about with Kirkbride, except maybe Wikipedia. If the only thing you looked at is Wikipedia, that is a little thin, I guess. It's not a super big page. But there's books that the man wrote himself. There's books written about the man. And then he doubles down on the thin biography thing and explains his claim.
But what I find fascinating about him is how when you look at his biography, it's as though there's just a perfunctory mention of his involvement with the plan, but then he spent the rest of his time being his own physician and treating his own patients. It's really strange. Almost as though he was the individual that they decided to assign credit to the plan to. Not that I'm saying that's what's happening, but oh yeah.
Oh yeah. I can't help but mock a little bit. Like, this is so stupid. Notice the Mott and Bailey fallacy here again, right? He says, not that I'm saying that's what's happening, but oh yeah. So he's claiming that they just pinned the whole asylum story on this one guy. But according to the biography he's referencing, which I don't know what it is, he's saying it's skimpy on details regarding Kirkbride's involvement. Well, guess what? There's a lot of details about Kirkbride's involvement from state to state, and we can look at that. But there's even more to his story than just what's on the wiki, of course. He's not even the first guy that put forward this plan, or at least a plan like it. Kirkbride was a Quaker, as I said, and the Quaker community was the community that first really got the ball rolling for the moral treatment of the insane. So he wasn't even the first guy to write a book advising other caregivers on the architecture question. Here is a book called Practical Hints on the Construction and Economy of Pauper Lunatic Asylums by Samuel Tuke, also a Quaker, from all the way in 1815. And in it, he writes a lot of stuff, but one thing that I found to be particularly exemplary of the whole movement was that they want to abolish chaining people up and, keeping them in the dungeon, essentially. Samuel Tuke wrote, Chains, which seemed to identify the madman and the felon, are discarded from some of the largest establishments, and maniacs, who for many years were manacled with irons, are on a sudden, under a more mild and vigilant system of management, found to be gentle and inoffensive. But though much has been done, much more still remains to be effected. There are still asylums which stand in need of reform. At a time, therefore, when so many asylums are erecting, it seems incumbent on those whose duty or inclination leads them to observe the wants of insane persons and the defects of the older erections to point them out for general consideration. So I'm showing you a great screenshot of page from this book where you can see how similar this book was to what Kirkbride wrote 30 or 40 years later. You got a architectural blueprint. You've got descriptions of all the different rooms, basically a plan. So once you read this book, it becomes very clear that Kirkbride was not some kind of patsy who shadowy elites pinned the asylum plan on so they could make their cover-up of the old world seem credible. Kirkbride was just one in a long line of reformers who was particularly effective at bringing about changes in his field. 30 seconds after claiming Kirkbride's involvement was ambiguous, Lucius says, Kirkbride was the one who was all about conducting it. It's the thing I have brought up before. Wikipedia says X. Wikipedia lies. So if you're saying something is all a lie, why are you pointing it out as if this is reality? I don't understand. But it's a true story. Kirkbride was the one who was all about conducting it, one amongst many, but he's the one that the name gets associated with. On 1845, Kirkbride went on a tour and kept a journal where the Pennsylvania Hospital Archives have labeled it Kirkbride Manuscript Journal of Visit to 9 Institutions for the Insane. Now, this book or manuscript journal wasn't digitized, but other researchers of Kirkbride's life, you might even call them biographers, have digitized or have cited it in their work. And just the very fact that this tour happened is corroborated by a lot of other sources like state legislatures who met with Kirkbride to talk about what they were going to do. Even before his book came out, he was touring the country, looking at other institutions for inspiration and to learn about what's working and what isn't working, and to give advice to people who were trying to build asylums in their own state. So the movement was happening with or without him. He was just the guy that became seen as the top expert to refer to and to consult with. For example, in Utica, New York, where they were building a really big asylum that was drafted by an amateur architect, Kirkbride stopped in and he wrote about it in his journal that the original plan for Utica was to occupy 13 acres and contain 1,000 patients, and it has been abandoned. He was referring to the fact that their reach exceeded their grasp and they had to downsize what their original plan was. And then in Trenton, New Jersey, the state legislature went to Kirkbride directly for his input on the building plan. I found the record of this, and he even wrote about that meeting in his second edition of his book. So here is from the votes and proceedings of the 69th and 70th General Assembly of the state of New Jersey. They really did solicit his advice. One quote that I pulled out of this: the general features of the first linear plan, which has been described, this is from Kirkbride's book where he wrote about meeting with the New Jersey legislature. The general features of the first linear plan, which has been described, were originally prepared by the writer, Kirkbride, at the request of the commissioners for putting up a state hospital for the insane in New Jersey. And the designs for that building were made from the sketches at that time furnished to its architect. Convenient, as most of the arrangements of that institution have been found to be, as it is regretted, that various modifications were made in the details of the original plan, which, although diminishing its cost, impaired its completeness and made it in many particulars much less effective or much less perfect than it otherwise would have been. The additions since made, however, have more than compensated for what was omitted or changed. And so here they are soliciting Kirkbride's advice in the state legislature of New Jersey. And having examined some of the principal asylums for the insane in this country and several plans of asylums which were presented, they, the legislature, finally adopted the general form submitted by Dr. Thomas Kirkbride. And just like every other asylum I looked at, the New Jersey asylum here that they were discussing building, there was a recognized need for it that they talk about in the legislature. There's a paper trail indicating it did not exist. The state government decided to build it. There's plans. Here's the building plan. Notman is the name of the architect. You can see his name down at the bottom. And this architect published the drawings for this New Jersey asylum in the 1848 issue of the American Journal of Insanity. So one thing that people have been saying to me when they don't just outright claim that all of these old-ass books, journals, and documents are fake somehow is that you're just reading the official fake history narrative back to us. But this is primary source material. These physically exist. They've been in these old archives before they were digitized, just sitting in boxes and stuff for decades and decades and decades. So if this is all just made up, if this is fabricated history, forged documentation, my God, the frauds did such a thorough and incredible job. I think they just deserve the win. Like, it's amazing. As if they were predicting the internet age and that people would sleuth this out. So they covered every possible contingency and they got all their stories straight. That just does not work. That does not make sense. Primary sources, firsthand accounts, even under oath for the legislative recorder who is writing all this down in the various state legislatures and assemblies that I looked at and that we will look at in the future of this coverage here.
But what I find fascinating about him is how when you look at his biography, it's as though there's just a perfunctory mention of his involvement with the plan, but then he spent the rest of his time being his own physician and treating his own patients. It's really strange. Almost as though he was the individual that they decided to assign credit to the plan to. Not that I'm saying that's what's happening, but oh yeah.
Yeah, man, it's really strange. A doctor spending most of his time practicing medicine. Really strange. Come on. Also, the word choice perfunctory here, I feel like I don't even know if he knows what it means, or if he does, he's using a word to make the audience think he sounds smart. I'm not sure. But perfunctory means something that's done as a routine formality without real interest or care. It's like if you're just going through the motions, doing something you have to do, you might do it in a perfunctory manner. Like your heart isn't in it. So nobody writes a perfunctory sentence about the thing a person is famous for. They write perfunctory sentences about the mundane and minutiae about the person's life. Kirkbride is constantly and regularly written about in this time period for his influence in the asylum plan, which is not perfunctory, it's the heart of the matter. His actual patient history and his practice itself as a doctor is what gets perfunctory treatment in the biographies because it's not the thing that's important about his impact on history. So basically, the perfunctory mention thing that he says here is the inverse of the truth, and it's just him creating the vibe of, ooh, mysterious, they're lying to you. And as for him being the individual who whoever they are, which is never really said, decided to assign credit for the plan to, is that not just how history works a lot of the time? Kirkbride gets the spotlight in history because they want to put a name on it. They put a name and a face. It's like a way to remember all the things that happened. This happens in history all the time, but he is totally not the only one who is documented as being creditable in this particular story. We can talk about the entire lineage of doctors throughout England and France that preceded Kirkbride, influenced his writing and the architectural ideas, and we'll show you some of those. Yeah, and then you have architects themselves who were a big part of this story. None of this would have got built without the architects involved. Like Stephen von Shipman, we're looking at here, he designed 5 of these Kirkbride buildings in more than one state. So, of course, it's more than just him involved. But the next things he says about Kirkbride, it gets even more ridiculous.
Oddly enough, this is Mr. Kirkbride's tombstone. Not really what you'd expect, though. I mean, a very modest tombstone. But I was expecting a much larger tombstone for somebody who is as famous and well known as Thomas Story Kirkbride.
Yeah, super weird. Look at that little baby tombstone, so tiny. But he was so famous. Yeah, he had a modest tombstone. And yeah, that is unusual for historically significant people, especially people who were recognized in their own day as widely as Kirkbride was in his lifetime. But we already mentioned he's a Quaker. And the first thing that you can find out about Quakers very easily is that their whole ideology was that it's inappropriate to elevate somebody over another person. They did not like fame and credit and stuff like that. They wanted everybody to be treated really equally and fairly. Modesty, meekness, humbleness, it's their whole MO. So if that's inappropriate to do in life, to elevate somebody above others, it's equally inappropriate to do it in death. This is totally normal Quaker behavior, actually. So here is a quotation from Swarthmore College, which is an old Quaker school in Pennsylvania. The disciplines of Philadelphia yearly meeting specifically forbade grave markers until the last quarter of the 19th century as marks of superfluity and excess and inconsistent with the plainness of our principles and practices. So what we're finding out here in this quote is that the practice of even having a tombstone itself, a simple gravestone, restricted only to just the name and the date of death only, and maybe the birthday, that came into use among the Quakers only around the late 1850s. And up until the point where Kirkbride died, that was about when it became common practice for them to do it. You could only do one that was really small and very modest. Before that, you couldn't even have one if you were a Quaker. Let's just see what Lucius said about 2 minutes before the tombstone bit he just did.
Apparently, he came from the old Quaker family.
Apparently, he came from the old Quaker family. So, self-defeat. He doesn't know it, but it's another self-defeat moment. Saying that it's odd that he has a little tombstone when it's the easiest thing in the world to verify that Quakers did not have big tombstones, no matter how important they might have been to history. He states the very evidence that resolves the later allegation of the grave being a problem. This is just rife in the Tartaria reset genre. They don't even know that they're self-defeating. Unless it's like a bit, and this is a joke on the audience, I don't know. But they never address the evidence that they put forward that undoes their own claim. They do it all the time.
Thomas Story Kirkbride, Story. I don't know. We always have these funny names of the architects, and now it is with the architect of the Kirkbride plan. Indeed. And that's what I think it boils down to, is welcome to the new reality.
Okay, so the fact that his middle name is Story, equals welcome to the new reality. We've just edited the story of reality. Very poetic claim. You know, sometimes the universe is poetic like that in ways that give us a clue to what lies below the surface of things. I don't dispute that, but sometimes a name is a name, or the poetry of it is elsewhere than what he's saying. It really shouldn't need to be said that one man's middle name being Story holds zero weight as proof of anything else that's claimed in the genre, but let's falsify it anyway. Story is code for welcome to the new reality. So I thought about this for 1 second, and I came to the idea that maybe Story was a surname, like his mother's maiden name. Could it be? I thought this because my own middle name is my mother's maiden name. Not a weird thing to do. And I looked it up. Bingo. His mother was Elizabeth Story before she married his father, who was named Kirkbride. Elizabeth's father was Thomas Story, and his father was John Story. Super easy to find out. And the surname of Story is well recorded in the Quaker community. Not weird at all. So here we go. Another pattern in the genre that you see all the time. Put forward a suggestive detail, project the suspicion vibe to the audience, and never follow up on whether or not the suggestive detail could be explained rationally. You do that enough in one video, and people who aren't going to look into it themselves because they trust you are going to come away from things with a very different impression than what the reality is. This kind of stuff annoys me. And I'm not even blaming the audience here. They're just taking in content. They're receiving the information being presented to them in good faith. It's not their job to do the due diligence. They're the consumer. It's the guy putting the video out who should do a better job than this.
The Kirkbride plan was a nationwide effort that the United States launched at a time when nationwide efforts were considered to be, well, ill-advised. We're supposed to believe that they decided to start this entire nationwide asylum plan in the 1850s. Where in the heck have they gotten the funding for it?
Well, that would be a great question. That would be a great question if there was a nationwide program. And without looking into it deeply, you might think there was a nationwide program. And then you'd have to ask, how did the federal government fund and direct resources to all of the different states who are doing this? The whole funding, resources, nationwide program thing, it might seem like a small issue once we immediately undo his claim about it, but it frames the majority of the content in this space, but especially the particular video we're looking at, that, oh, it's a nationwide program. They couldn't have done that. The example given is a Civil War being a nationwide program, and obviously that didn't go well. How income tax didn't exist at the time. So where's the federal government getting this money? I guess it's a reasonable question until you realize that it's a straw man. I don't know if he knows that it's a straw man. I actually think he probably doesn't. I don't think he looked into it closely enough. A straw man is when a debater invents an argument for his opponent and then he attacks that not true argument, or that argument that the opponent never made. His national premise, national program, that is flat out wrong. There was no such federal program. Each of the 25 states that built asylums during this era had to figure out their own funding and their own resources, all on their own. And usually there was disagreement involved, and it's all on the record. There's a lot of record about it. You know, it's like in the modern time, a contractor going over budget and past his deadline is a cliche now, and it was a thing back then. I found evidence for all of it. Now, I will, in fairness, say that the nationwide program idea, on the surface, before you look closely into this, it would seem like the Kirkbride plan was some kind of national program, because you could call it a national movement in the sense that all these different states were picking up the same idea and rolling with it. And in my previous video, when I brought up the Kirkbride plan, I might have even used language that was similar to the whole nationwide program thing. At that time, I never looked into the federal role until I saw Lucius making this claim. And I was like, you know what? He's right. How did the federal government fund it? Oh, they didn't. That's the answer. So it's an umbrella name for a whole movement. It's the headline. It naturally sounds like it was a top-down thing organized from above. but it was not. I can prove it very easily. The United States federal government explicitly refused to create such a program. Specifically, the refusal came from the 14th President of the United States, one Franklin Pierce. A bill was presented by Congress to hand 10 million acres of federal land to the different states, and the interest off the sale of that land would have been used to fund permanent care for the indigent insane nationwide. This was a bill introduced to the lawmakers by Dorothy Dix, who's a very famous lobbyist for mental health care reform at the time. And then President Pierce shot it down on May 3rd, 1854. To the Senate of the United States. The bill entitled An Act Making a Grant of Public Lands to the Several States for the Benefit of Indigent Insane Persons, which was presented to me on the 27th ultimo, has been maturely considered and is returned to the Senate, the House in which it originated, with a statement of the objections which have required me to withhold it from my approval. In the performance of this duty, prescribed by the Constitution, I have been compelled to resist the deep sympathies of my own heart in favor of the humane purpose sought to be accomplished, and to overcome the reluctance with which I dissent from the conclusions of the two houses of Congress, and present my own opinions in opposition to the action of a coordinate branch of the government which possesses so fully my confidence and respect. So in spite of the deep sympathies of his own heart, he vetoed the bill for a specific constitutional principle. If the federal government can hand out cash to care for the insane, it can hand out cash to care for everybody. In other words, he was against federal welfare. His own words in the veto: it cannot be questioned that if Congress has the power to make provision for the indigent insane without the limits of this district, it has the same power to provide for the indigent who are not insane, and thus transfer to the federal government the charge of all the poor in the states. Yeah, man. Based. Actually, pretty based. Once you open the door for that one form of welfare, you have opened the door to someday universal welfare, which, of course, it eventually did happen in our country, but not on President Franklin Pierce's watch. Well done, sir. He also expressed worries that federal money would corrupt the states themselves, that they'd stop funding their own institutions and just start waiting on the federal government handout, becoming what he called humble suppliants for the bounty of the federal government. And so that's the answer. This is why almost every one of the asylums that I've looked into, I've been able to find debates in the respective state legislatures about how to pay for these buildings. The state legislatures have super thorough, well-recorded, under oath minutes for each session of their Congress. All of it has been kept because they're important records. They're archived. They're digitized. They're even Control-F searchable. None of this is concealed. Anyone can look it up. State after state with a similar asylum story, but their own twist on it. You know, at first glance, it looks like a nationwide program. In reality, it was each state deciding how to deal with the problem of mental illness on their own. And most of them, just like happens today, they opted to follow the recommendations of who they saw as the leading experts of the day, which is Kirkbride and his fellows. But hey, let's do justice to the question, where did the resources come from? How did they coordinate it? Since we can't answer that question for all of the asylums at once, I've just shown you why you have to take this on a case-by-case basis. There is no federal funding. There is no big lump sum of money that was split and divided amongst all the states to do this. Never happened. So the best we can do is look at them one at a time. And if we look at a few and we find the paper trail, we already know that the statement Lucius made was either a lie or just wrong, and he never looked into it. We don't really need to prove it for every asylum. We just need to disprove what he said.
It's just really bizarre how they would have coordinated this, where the resources came from, the monetary resources, the building materials. Of course, that's always a question with all these things.
Yes, it's always a question with all of these things. How did they fund it? They couldn't have built it. Where did the materials come from? Every freaking Tartaria reset video, they always say that. And apparently they never bother to find out, because Every time I try to find out, I find at least something that helps me understand how did they do it. This is Fulton, Missouri, my home state. The asylum in Fulton was authorized by the Missouri General Assembly in 1847, at which time they made the counties who wanted the asylum compete with each other by putting up bids. This happened in many states. We talked about it in the last video with Provo in Utah. The county who was willing to put up the most cash and the best land for the institution would usually get it. Now, the question of why would you want an insane asylum in your county? That might be a question you would have up front. Might seem weird. Essentially, it's good for your economy. And that's why the counties were competing for it. So in Missouri, Callaway County, where Fulton is at, won with a bid of $11,500 and 500 acres of land. They contracted Solomon Jenkins in April of 1849 to build it after he gave them a bid, what's called a tender in that time, of $47,450. By January, 2 years later, 1851, Solomon reported that his costs had gone over 50 grand. Contractor over budget? Oh no. It happens. He submitted a detailed expense report or expenditures analysis to the legislature, and I found that. And he argued that even though it was over budget, they got off cheap because those suckers in New Jersey had spent $150,000, which is crazy to think about. New England money. Here's an engraving of the asylum in Fulton. So think about what an asylum would be to a frontier county's economy, or even to a non-frontier New England state. It's an anchor institution. You're guaranteed multiple years of construction contracts that are going to put your stonemasons and physical laborers to work. They're going to get paid. Their money is going to stay in the community. And then you have a permanent payroll for attendants, cooks, farmers, tradesmen. People are going to get jobs at the asylum. You have a guaranteed year-round market for local produce, coal, brick, things like that, repair work. So it's like a never-ending cash cow for the local economy. People are going to get work, and you're going to have someone to sell to all the time. And not to mention, there's a prestige that you get if you have a big, important state institution in your county, and you might get something else big given your way. If you demonstrate your town grows, you become more important, So towns were fighting for asylums the same way that towns today might have a bidding war for a university campus or an army base. The competition was real because the money possibility was very real. So if you look in my Substack article or on the document that I share on Patreon or on my website with all the notes for this, I give you links to all of the primary sources that I get these bids and expenditures for Missouri. We're talking about the 15th General Assembly, the 16th General Assembly, a report of the commissioners to locate a lunatic asylum, all of that stuff. Lots of records here. The last legislature made some provision for the erection of a lunatic asylum. To make the location, 3 commissioners were appointed who selected Fulton in Callaway County as the place entitled to the asylum under the provisions of the law. That's from the Journal of the Senate. And then we have a mock-up from Solomon Jenkins that he submitted to the Senate. And we have from the notes and minutes of the state legislature where they write, at the suggestion of Dr. Kirkbride of the Philadelphia Hospital for the Insane, we have caused to be built a large shaft at the extreme ends of each wing with an opening into each of the corridors. Through the agency of these shafts, a strong draft may be produced at any time that it may be desired, and consequently a ready circulation of fresh warm air or cool air at pleasure. It may be so managed as to produce a circulation in either one or all of the wards as may be necessary. The advantages of natural ventilation on this plan are believed to be equal, if not superior, to any now in use. So here they are talking about the Mo state legislature, talking about why the Kirkbride building was superior, because they thought fresh air was a big deal to being healthy. And the way that the building is designed in that shallow V shape means that if you open a window on one side and on the other side, you get a breeze going through the whole thing, basically free air conditioning. And here's the expense report from good old Solomon. He's paying for a steam engine. There's something that people are always like, how did they do this with horse and buggy? They lived in a shack. Cowboys couldn't build this. They paid $1,000 for a steam engine. You think that might have had something to do with how they hoisted things and erected things? They had steam power to help them do it. 900 feet of iron pipe, $900. So that tells you that 100 feet of iron pipe is $1 per foot. They paid for cisterns, bathrooms, sewer system, water pipe. I mean, it goes on and on. You see everything that he spent money on. One lodge or madhouse to be built capable of containing 24 maniacs, $7,500. This is what you might call a receipt. This is what finding the receipts looks like. This is what you have to do before you have any credibility when making a claim. Notice that the Missouri State Legislature adopted Kirkbride's suggestion. That was directly the wording. Not a federal mandate, not federally funded. They had to come up with the money from the taxpayer. And in the report of the commissioners to locate a lunatic asylum, it says, quote, "The people of the state are willing to be taxed to build a commodious house, comfortable in every respect, to take care of their fellow human beings who are suffering under one of the greatest scourges that can afflict the human race." So the people of the state are willing to be taxed. More like the lawmakers who say they represent the people are willing to tax the people. But that's how it's getting paid for. Taxes. Interestingly enough, Missouri lawmakers were not interested in dealing with insane people at all until 1844, 3 years before they came up with this decision, I think 3 or so years, to make the Fulton Asylum. Governor Reynolds actually committed suicide, Thomas Reynolds. And he left a suicide note. He did it in the governor's office, which is pretty crazy. And he left a note that said, the vicious treatment and attacks, verbal attacks, they're hurting me, of my political opponents has made life unbearable. So that is the event that moved the needle and brought about the state's first asylum. It was a dead governor, not a national plan or a federal handout or federal requirement. Now, maybe there was foul play. Maybe somebody was invested in getting an asylum built for their own economic reasons, and they made it look like a suicide. Who knows? Those kind of mysteries I could entertain if presented a little more evidence. But it's not a Tartaria mystery, guys. And if it means anything to you, the legislative clerks and secretaries who recorded these documents and minutes and all that of the legislative meetings, they are under oaths of office to perform their duties truthfully and faithfully. If that counts for anything to you. I've just shown you that the Tartaria genre over and over again never took any oath to perform their duty truthfully and faithfully. In fact, they like to put on their channels that it's not to be considered factual for entertainment purposes only. We'll talk about that at the end. So I'd rather take the word of the credible witnesses under oath than the oafs who take no oath and even tell you on the back end of their channel that it's not factual, entertainment only. Who should we take the word of, you know? I mean, these are literally accounting ledgers. The Tartaria Reset channels, they're constantly saying, logistics, resources, you can't account for it. Where did they get the bricks? But I'm showing you primary documents from how they did it, how they paid for it, things like that. I mean, we'll just see more and more of this. So when I hear they couldn't have built that, I'm open to it. Show me how that conclusion is reached. But I'm getting less and less open to it because I keep learning so much about how they built stuff back then. I'm like, oh, okay. Well, this applies to all of the construction in the era. They had steam power. They had skill. They had grit. And they were our ancestors, not some Mongolian barbarian Tartars. Get out of here with that shit.
You might recall if we looked at Independence Hospital in Iowa, you really can't find any record of construction or the architect. They needed an insane asylum, so boom, they had it. And off it was and ready to go.
This is Independence, Iowa, the main building of the state hospital there. And that statement of you can't find any record of construction or the architect. They just needed an asylum and boom, we're ready to go. That's incorrect. And the way that is said so directly and confidently is like the most dishonest thing in the whole video of his, possibly. I can't believe that you could just outright claim that there's no record of construction or architect. There absolutely is a record of construction and an architect. So let's just go through all of the record because there's so much record. This ends up being a pretty interesting case study. In the 12th General Assembly of the Iowa Legislature, I found where Senator W.G. Donnan introduced a bill which passed in April of 1868 for the construction of the Independence Asylum. Here's another more modern photo. This building seems to still be around. And we have here the actual bill being passed. Be it enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Iowa that there shall be and is hereby permanently established at Independence, Buchanan County, Iowa, an additional institution for the support and care of the insane. And then it goes on to talk about the commissioners that are appointed to superintend the erection of suitable buildings. That said board shall select the most eligible and desirable location of not less than 320 acres. It must not in any event be more than 2 miles distant from said city of Independence, which said lands shall be obtained free of charge to the state, and said board shall take a deed of conveyance of the same in fee simple to the state of Iowa, and cause the same to be properly recorded in the office of the recorder of deeds of the county of Buchanan. Said board shall also, at earliest day practicable, procure plans, drawings, and specifications for the buildings necessary and proper for said institution, the exterior of which building shall be of stone, the stone to be procured within the state, but the plan determined on by the board shall be such as will admit of future enlargement, so as to preserve the symmetry, and be, when ultimately completed, of capacity equal to the present building at Mount Pleasant. And it goes on. That's just the first page. So the Iowa legislature gives an approbation for $125,000 to build this. The state's kicking in a lot of money, and they require the citizens of Independence in Buchanan County to give a little too, to donate the land to the state at no cost, which they achieved by public subscription. Now, that's a common practice in the era. It's like crowdfunding of the day. You get local businesses and wealthy individuals and even your typical man on the street to kick in what they can to the cause. And sometimes, and a lot of times, there were direct benefits to the big donors, not least of which is the fact that you get a lot of prestige and reputational increase in your county. But I thought, you know what? If we're talking about the how did they fund it question, I need more than just the state gave money and the county did a public subscription. Can we get some names? Who in the county? Surely there's a record of this. And I could not find anything in a Google search at all of any records of who actually gave money to this insane asylum for the land. So I started doing a more laborious search of newspapers from Buchanan County in that time period. And I found the Buchanan County Bulletin, which has been microfilmed and scanned, and you can find it online. In April of 1868, not long after the bill was passed, the Buchanan County Bulletin announced a meeting at the courthouse about the asylum plan. And it said, "The more the question of the location of the insane asylum is at this point considered, the more apparent does it become to the minds of our people that we cannot afford to lose it, that the money to procure the 320 acres of land demanded by the state must be raised at all hazards, that we shall be recreant to every principle of interest, progress, and pride if we fail to do it." Well, you wouldn't want to be recreant. That's not a good thing to be. And then we have May 1st, 1868, same newspaper. "The subscriptions for the asylum have now reached the sum of $6,000 with a number of individuals to hear from. There is every probability that $10,000 will have to be raised to secure such a site as is demanded by the interests of the town and state." Yeah, so they're saying every man should give something because every man is to be benefited. "A number of our wealthy men are considering the matter earnestly and will doubtless subscribe liberally in proportion to their possessions." And then I found the real kicker here was a list of donors that appeared in the May 8th, 1868 newspaper. And I don't know how to be more thorough than a list of donors. And the list is very large. You can see it on my Substack. And I just got here a part of it in the slides, but We're talking the full page all the way down. You scroll, and you got all these names who are kicking in money. We present below a complete list of the subscriptions thus far made for the purchase of grounds for the insane asylum. So the best part, I think, is at the bottom of this paper where it says, it is a noteworthy fact that those of our farmers near the city who have been asked to subscribe have exhibited most praiseworthy liberality, but very few of our businessmen and capitalists have refused to contribute. So basically saying, everybody's doing it. I'm naming everyone. And if your name isn't on this list, shame on you. The paper is basically low-key shaming social pressure over this public building. Now, if you look at the top here, you got a PC Wilcox who says 1/20th of the amount required, provided it does not exceed $12,000. Now, that guy was a big baller. We got a lot of folks on this list giving $10, $5, even $2. Some people giving like 20, 50, even 100. But PC Wilcox, he was down to give up to $12,000. So I thought, we got to find out who PC Wilcox is. I looked up that name in the Iowa history, and it turns out he was like a big shot merchant in Independence at the time. So I reckon he probably owned the general store, the biggest one, or maybe a few of them. So here we have a guy who stands to profit a lot, because an asylum that's going to have hundreds of inmates and a lot of employees, they're going to be coming to his general store for dry goods week after week, year after year, for potentially forever, for as long as he's going to live. So even though he's kicking in a huge amount of money, that guy's going to make a lot of money off of the asylum for sure, just in the sales of his goods to the asylum itself. Not to mention, if the town grows, that's good for his business too. So it totally makes sense that he's going to be kicking in. I was really excited about that find, because think about it. I looked in all the books that I could find, all the write-ups I could find about the asylum. Nobody had ever published any list of names or records, and I found the newspaper that named the names. That was like a legit discovery moment. I spent hours looking for it. I was pretty excited. No construction records exist, huh? Well, let's see about that, Lucius. There's also another interesting footnote about the Buchanan County Bulletin. I have a book called The 1914 Buchanan County History, which is linked in my notes as a PDF if anyone wants to peruse it. Interesting little bit of county history. And in it, they thank a Mr. E. Little, who loaned them the valuable old Buchanan County Bulletin and Guardian files. That's the name of the newspaper. The only files in existence prior to 1870. It also says in there that for a lapse of several years, there are no newspaper files to consult to substantiate facts, they having been destroyed in the Big Fire of 1874. So maybe there was some kind of intentional destruction of records to hide the history of Tartaria in Buchanan County, or it was just an absolutely normal fire that happens sometimes and the paper got burned up. And luckily, this cool old guy happened to be collecting the paper, and before the end of his life, he turned over his collection to the county. I think that's really cool. You also get from Lucius that you can't find a record of the architect for the Independence, Iowa Asylum. But we already talked about this guy, Stephen von Shipman, who designed this and 4 other Kirkbride asylums. That information's right on the Wikipedia page. So that's why I consider the statement that you can't find an architect. I think that's more than just bad research or not checking. That feels like a lie. I don't know how else to categorize it. I think he lied. He's definitely incentivized to lie. His whole channel is built on this shit. What about you can't find any records of the construction? I actually found so many receipts about the construction of the Iowa building here that I was overwhelmed with trying to decide what to even show you and at what point it's overkill. And I probably landed on the side of overkill. But let's give you some highlights from a few books that document the history of Buchanan County, and they talk about the workforce on this project. I've attached them as PDFs. These come from way back in the day, one of them being like 1881. And we have, first of all, a description of one Alexander Boyack I found in here, born 1829 in Scotland, came to America at the age of 23. He opened a stone quarry and he hauled the first load of rock to build the new magnificent asylum before the ground was surveyed for its erection. If somebody happened to be a descendant of this guy, I bet you that there's family lore about great-great-great-grandpappy being a quarry guy and helping build the asylum. Turns out Iowa has got a lot of granite, and quarrying is not that hard to do there. The other book was The History of Buchanan County, Iowa and Its People from 1914. So between these two books, I found a few other people who have accounts of them helping build it. You got George Netcott Jr., who was a stonemason. He first worked on the original smokestack at the Iowa hospital. He later founded George Netcott Brickyards in 1880. All of that is 100% verifiable. There was a company called that. Then you have Charles Fest, a stonemason native to Germany who erected the insane asylum at Independence, or he assisted at it. The county history gives all of his family descendant history up to that point. His daughter Louisa married a Mr. Bolton in 1878. I mean, it's very detailed. And another document, Report of Commissioners for the Erection of Buildings for an Insane Asylum at Independence to the Governor of the State of Iowa, January 1870. PDF in my notes. It says that the land procured for the site of the hospital is unbroken prairie, without a building or a fence or a tree upon it. There's so many corroborating reports, I really can't get behind the thesis that these were pre-existing compounds repurposed, especially when I catch the guy telling me that, lying about other stuff. So why would I just take your word for it when you've shown me no evidence at all for your theory, and everything that I can find goes completely against your theory? For entertainment purposes only, of course. Still, the question of how do you build something this big, this fast on an open prairie, that's a question worth asking. As we were looking at before in the Independence Commissioner's own words, the site was unbroken prairie. I constantly see the Tartaria genre content, those type of creators, they're questioning brick accounting. Like, where's the brick coming from? How did they make the brick? How did they haul the brick? Bricks, bricks, bricks. They're shitting bricks about the bricks all the time. Lucius questions bricks in this video we're talking about, but he directs that at the Napa, California facility, not the Iowa one. But maybe that's because the Iowa record about the bricks is pretty clear. Not that I think he looked. In the commission report that I just named, it says, the contractor has succeeded in making on the west end of the hospital farm, where excellent brick clay has been found, some 800,000 brick, of which 580,000 have been laid in the building, leaving about 220,000 on hand for use in the spring. He is also contracting for a sufficient quantity of wood to be delivered at the brickyard this winter to burn the remaining amount of brick necessary to fill his contract, which will be about 600,000 more. So that's like 1.5 million bricks, which sounds a lot, but that's pretty normal for a building of this size. They made the bricks on site. That helps a lot with the logistics question, wouldn't you say? Now, whenever I was doing this part of the presentation my first time before I started over, I paused at this point because I had a light bulb moment of, hey, maybe I should verify that it's even possible for there to be the clay in the amounts needed for these accounting figures. Because 800,000 bricks, that sounds like a lot. So I didn't want to repeat this without checking into it myself. Could they have gotten that much brick clay on site? And the answer turned out to be yes, easily. And it's very anticlimactic, unfortunately. 800,000 fired bricks. I think, I'm not an expert in this, but I tried to find good answers to the question. Maybe something like 2,000 cubic yards of raw clay when you account for the shrinkage and water loss. That's just a totally rough estimate. Essentially, there's a pit being dug about 1/4 acre wide and 5 feet deep. 5 feet deep isn't that crazy, especially if you have a lot of people working on it. And you're spreading this out across potentially multiple years of construction, or you just do this first. And honestly, the Iowa Geological Survey answer to my question about regional reports of the glacial mantle across this part of the state that supposedly runs 75 to 150 feet thick, This is, I guess, a large part of the state is made up of what's called glacial till and lows, which are allegedly standard brickmaking material. And I tend to believe that that's the case because Iowa, I found, had more than 300 brick and tile works operating by the 1920s because of exactly this situation. The glacial formation under Independence itself even has a name. It's called the Winthrop Till. The state describes it as a loam to light clay loam. The ground is basically averaging about 25% clay, which is totally good enough to make bricks. And it's sitting right there where they built. I also found that it was common practice in the 19th century to begin brick making on site after the foundations and basements of a new building had been dug out. So you may have been able, I don't know if that's how they did it here, but oftentimes they dig the foundation, the basement and all that, and the dirt that they just removed for the building project itself, they just turn that into brick. However much of it they can, they turn into brick. It seems like a pretty efficient multitask. Seems like a good way to account for the brick logistics. Also, not everything on this building is brick. There's limestone, there's granite. All of that stuff happens to exist in Buchanan County. People still find it today in their farm field. Boulders of granite and limestone under the ground, all kinds. So you have three very local materials, potentially local to the very ground under their feet when they're building this thing. Logistically, what you have to haul in is going to be timber and metal, that kind of stuff. The report of commissioners that I mentioned even has a line-by-line ledger of expenses. They paid the architect $3,600. They actually were under budget at the point of this report. They'd come up with $100,000 in expenses and they still had $24,000 that they could spend. I mean, they're giving the cost of individual items down to the nail. 30 cents for 5 pounds of nails, tracing cloth, the cost of sending a telegraph to the architect, $1.65. It's called receipts. But possibly my favorite thing in the document is this, quote, "The British colony of New South Wales, Australia, at the antipodes, what they call the far end of the world, containing a population of less than half of that of Iowa, instructed her commissioner, before adopting a plan of her hospital for the insane, to visit all the chief institutions of the kind in Europe and America." That was a really cool find because at the end of this presentation, we're going to talk about the asylums in Australia and New Zealand. Because if anything, Lucius doesn't go hard enough at it. I feel like if there were buildings like this that seemed fishy, it would be the colonies out down under where the population is much smaller and the colony has been there a lot less time. So we're going to go into that. But the fact that I found documentation in Iowa, someone's talking about what they're doing in Australia in the same field, the same psychiatry asylum architecture thing. I thought that was really cool. So the Iowa commissioners knew about the New South Wales study tour, and they cited it as their justification for also doing a study tour. They did this regularly. Before they would erect an asylum, they would go around the country. They'd send some people around the country to check out what everyone else was doing and try to do a better job. Try to see what's working and what's not working. And here is a report of the Joint Committee to the 15th General Assembly, State of Iowa, the Asylum Committee, writing about, did we do a good job with this asylum? And it says, "Gentlemen, your committee appointed to visit the hospitals for the insane located at one at Independence, the other at Mount Pleasant, would say that it has discharged this duty and respectfully submits the following report. The work on the hospital at Independence, so far as it has progressed, bears every evidence of being well and substantially done and of the best and most durable material. And it is gratifying to be able to state that the original plan for the building had been so thoroughly digested as to avoid the expense consequent upon frequent changes." So there they are. They're just like, we crushed it. Look at this. Amazing. We did a great job. Bravo, everyone. Around the same time in his video, Lucius brings up another Iowa asylum here.
Now, when you try looking into the historical records of Cherokee, Iowa, things get really, really obfuscated.
Things get really, really obfuscated. You got anything to back that up with, man? Here is the Cherokee, Iowa Asylum from kirkbridebuildings.com. Very cool website. I'm not going to bother with going super detailed. Let's just leave it at the architect is named Henry Lieb of Des Moines. The Cherokee residents campaigned from 1894 to get this asylum. They competed against other towns like Sheldon, Lamar, Fort Dodge, Storm Lake, and others. It took 14 ballots in the legislature to be approved for Cherokee. The legislature appropriated $12,000 to purchase the site. Different than the other one, Cherokee wasn't forced to pay for it themselves. It opened August 15th, 1902 as Iowa's fourth asylum. I have a building inventory from the opening, 1,810 windows, 1,030 doors, 46 outside doors, blah, 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 blah. 93,000 yards of plastering. I mean, the account books are there. It's all just as thorough as the Independence one. So the fact that I just showed you Independence where he said no records exist, I found all these records. I think I've earned some credit to say that, guess what? It's not obfuscated. Cherokee, Iowa, not obfuscated. That is not true. It's just not true.
Here's another image of it. And they didn't even have the road paved, or so they say. It was just a dirt road and then a couple paths that ran up to it. Horrible vanilla skies on this one.
They didn't even have the road paved. Oh my God. Giant mystery. They didn't pave roads before cars. That's not hard to find out. Totally normal for roads before the 20th century. You don't need paved roads without cars. And then we have the infamous vanilla skies. Bum, bum, bum. But seriously, this is their bread and butter. They're always pointing out the vanilla skies, vanilla skies. This is actually not weird, but you have to know something about this era of photos. You got flat, blown out, bright white skies. Sometimes they paint the clouds on. That really did happen. It's really a thing. Tartaria isn't inventing that in their genre, but they're always pointing at it as the proof they're hiding something. I'm going to give a technical explanation of why this happened. But first, let's talk about why they're always pointing out vanilla skies, why it's their favorite framing device possibly ever about the photography. It's part of the template of the Tartaria reset genre. Here's a screenshot I took from a short form video from the Tartaria genre, some Instagram account. And the video claims the reason they whited out the skies in old photographs was to conceal the existence of airships and dirigibles and blimps and all that. I don't think so. How did they have a photo of these dirigibles and blimps in your example? Why didn't they white that out? You got a white sky behind them. If they bothered whiting out the sky for this photo, why didn't they white out the blimps in the photo too? So no, that's not proof of anything like that. And I could even entertain the notion, and I might look into it, that oil companies intentionally smeared and memory hold all the competition with aerial technology so they could maximize their profits with planes and jet fuel and all that. I think it's pretty plausible. The whole Hindenburg disaster seems like a sort of corporate false flag. We might look into it. But vanilla skies is actually normal for the era. Why? It's because of photographic emulsion at the time. It's the type of photography technology. It uses silver halide crystals, silver bromide, some silver iodide, and those crystals are naturally sensitive to blue and ultraviolet light and almost blind to everything else. In 1873, a German chemist named Hermann Wilhelm Vogel figured out how to dye sensitize the emulsions to also be able to catch green and yellow. And that dyed emulsion is what got the name orthochromatic, but it still could not register red at all. Sky is blue and loaded with ultraviolet. Land and foliage are not, so on an orthochromatic plate, the sky massively overexposes to a blank white or pale gray, while the ground exposes normally. What that means is that when you take a photo of something and it's a blue sky behind it, and maybe even white clouds, the blue is going to be way overexposed because the orthochromatic is picking it up so much more sensitively. So because of that technology, a photo that has a good exposure and good detail in the foreground and the building it's taking a picture of or what have you is going to have a sky that looks totally white and featureless. That is the vanilla skies effect as named by Tartaria. It is a universal artifact of the chemistry of that era of photography. No big deal. He still goes on about it, though. I don't know if you ever looked into this explanation.
Do these clouds look real? Look at these clouds. This is probably why I sound sarcastic some of the time, because I see photos like this and I really just can't contain myself. Oh yeah, some real looking clouds. Looks like they got Bob Ross to do some painting on this one. Look at this figure right here. I mean, this entire image just looks completely off.
Okay, well, they might have got a Bob Ross to do the photos here, or the painting over this photo, but it's an established practice of photography of that period. I'm going to go over this more thoroughly in a separate video, but let me just give you the rundown. There's two techniques of photography in this period. You have combination printing, where a photographer would shoot the landscape on one negative and keep the camera right where it was and do a separate negative for the clouds, as in a different exposure so that you could see the clouds in the sky better. And then he would combine the two and print both on a piece of paper. There's a guy named Gustave Le Gray who pioneered this for his 1856-1857 seascape photography. And he figured out how to do it specifically because you could not get a single exposure, a single photo to capture both the sky and the sea at the same time. And then the other technique was just retouching by hand, literally painting clouds right on the negative or the finished print. Both are a documented, taught, openly discussed, normal photography practice, and there's nothing concealed about it. There's nothing fraudulent about it. That's just how they did it back then. There's a book from 1869 by Henry Peach Robinson that's a manual for how to do this called Pictorial Effect in Photography. And it walks through how to do combination printing that I just talked about that Gustave Le Gray was a pioneer of. Basically, if you see a white blown out sky, it's not evidence of tampering. It's a dating tool. You can guess that the photo predates 1906 probably. You know, about an hour into the live stream, Lucius makes a point where he says, image provenance matters. Yes, that's true, but uncertain image provenance goes both ways. And he actually doesn't bother giving provenance of any image he's provided. Whether or not it's documented in the record, he never talks about it. So I appreciate that you make that point, but this very photo we're looking at here, the provenance of this image matters a lot to the weird texture of why it looks like this. And I'm going to talk about that later in the video. We'll dig into it even further. Now back to what he says about Cherokee, Iowa for a second.
It does look post-apocalypse, you know. And it gets better because they originally didn't have a railroad going to Cherokee.
They originally didn't have a railroad going to Cherokee. You think we could find out if that's true? What do you mean by originally? What's the time frame? The Stone Age? What are you talking about? This asylum opened in 1902. Probably by 1902, somewhere as far east as Iowa has some railroads going through it. Very easy to find that out. The railroad depot in Cherokee, Iowa first opened in 1870, 32 years before the opening of the asylum. So what are you talking about, dude? Is that a mainstream history made up detail too? Give me a break. Here's a little research I did on the subject. It took me 2 minutes. I found a map of the railroads in Iowa at that time period, and I found a map of Iowa where Cherokee is at, specifically where was the asylum. And if you look, there's this little divot right here by Dubuque, and the line that goes there from Dubuque to Waterloo. And if you look at where Cherokee is at, that little dip in Wisconsin to the right, you go all the way to the left there. It looks like the red line could not be more right on the money to go near the asylum. I don't know how to do better than that. There's no doubt the asylum had access to a railroad that was pretty close, but I digress. The whole remoteness of these asylums being away from very dense population centers and on large acreages of land was the whole crux of the Kirkbride doctrine, environmental determinism. In his book, he says you need a rural site of at least 100, if not 250 acres. The asylum needed to be able to grow its own food and make a work therapy out of the farming process for patients who were well enough to help. So, toil maxing. They needed clean food, clean air, clean water. Therefore, you need a rural setting. And then a nice building was part of the treatment plan too. It's what we call terrain medicine. We'll talk about this more.
So this is what the layout of these asylums were, and it's called the Batwing layout. And don't you find it interesting that the Batwing layout doesn't exactly seem like it'd be something conducive towards the recovery of patients that are really suffering from mental illness. So the justification that Thomas Story Kirkbride gave for this was that you'd have all these patients on these outer rooms and they would get sunlight.
Okay, some self-defeat here. I really don't understand it. He knows enough about the Kirkbride plan and the layout to know that the way that this building is designed, where these thin wings have windows on both sides, guarantees that every patient has sunlight. Nobody's in a dark cellar, in a dark interior room. He doesn't seem to understand the whole ventilation aspect of this, but if the whole point of an alleged fabricated historical narrative about these buildings, if the purpose of that fabricated narrative about Kirkbride is that it's supposed to be convincing, shouldn't it be supposed to make sense? And he goes, it's not supposed to make sense. Of course, it does make sense if you understand the ideology. And even though modern people see Gothic architecture and it's in an old-timey black and white photo and it's got the label of an insane asylum and you get the heebie-jeebies about that, that has something to do probably with horror movies of the modern day and how the aesthetic of the Gothic building even got connected to insanity and madness probably because of this. But at the time when this was being built in the 19th century, it was the pinnacle. It was the top. It was the most beautiful architecture that you could get. It was excellent, right? Not disconcerting for the people of that time. Either way, the design logic is super well documented. The AMSAII in 1851 published 26 propositions on the construction and organization of asylums that was published in the American Journal of Insanity. You got Kirkbride's 1854 book 3 years later that explains it. The Batwing echelon setback V-shape arrangement is for cross-ventilation, sunlight, all of that. It's based on the pre-germ theory miasma medicine. Fresh air and fresh light are literally the healing factor. Kirkbride wrote about the therapeutic effect of cheerful, well-lighted halls and parlors. The whole Gothic, Tudor, Greek revival styling was an intentional rejection of the prison aesthetic. It was meant to be picturesque. It was meant to be meant to feel good. The verandas and balconies across the top are supposed to help with supervised outdoor airing, which is part of the treatment too. Coming up in the members-only part 2 of this episode, you just saw why Tartaria theory is thoroughly wrong about insane asylums in 19th century America. And on the members side, we go international with the investigation. We can go deep. Let's go deep. The visual similarity of 19th century asylums from country to country is real. It was big, complete with even a clock tower here. We're talking about a colony of 750,000. That is worth investigating, if there's anything to the reset theory. His name was Francis Greenway, and he was a convict sent to Australia for forgery. Come on, this is like a lost opportunity, bro. The image that he's showing is older than the plan that he's calling it evidence for by 100 years. That is a very clean self-defeat moment. Sorry, buddy. Part 2 covers the actual origin of this architecture and just how a bunch of convicts shipped to Australia managed to build one of the biggest asylums in the world. All the other pillars of the Tartaria House of Cards are going to come down just as easily. Join me for Part 2 on Interverse Plus. So now that we've looked at this asylum topic incredibly thoroughly, right? We've looked at all around the world, these different buildings, where they came from, the entire school of thought that developed so that these asylums would later be built, the terrain model of medicine, all these different facets, the origin of the pavilion hospital system, looked at the paper trail and the literal receipts for many, many asylums in the United States specifically. Now that we've done all that, and I think proven to the hilt that the Tartaria reset theory regarding these asylums does not hold any water or credibility, I think that it's time to move on from the asylum topic. And it might be time to move on from the Tartaria reset worldview, because we looked at John Levi last time. We looked at an article from Tartaria Britannica. We just looked at this guy, Lucius Aurelian. The John Levi and Lucius are two of the biggest channels in the whole Tartaria YouTube genre. I can't find many that are bigger than them. They're definitely two of the most popular, have spread these ideas really far. So we have to ask ourselves, why do they have this same type of language on their description on their YouTube channel? John Levi, a channel dedicated to exploring the forgotten history of humanity and other mysteries. Truth requires leaving the comfort of belief behind. All material is intended for entertainment purposes only. Okay. All right. Lucius Aurelian, a channel dedicated to exploring the mysteries of overlooked truth of human existence. We embark on a journey of self-discovery through looking at our own experiences, methods of entertainment, and the way we see our existence. All material is intended for entertainment purposes only. And actually, if you read the rest of the boilerplate description between Levi and Aurelian, like pause it and read the whole thing, they're basically identical to each other. Like one copied the other, or I don't know why that would be. And then another channel, one of the other really big ones, this has got 186,000 subscribers. And it says at the bottom, the content and material presented should not be regarded as factual. It is meant for commentary and entertainment only. So between these three channels, three of the very biggest, we're talking millions and millions of views, hundreds of thousands of subscribers. Okay. Why did they all say for entertainment purposes only? I think it might have something to do with a kind of legal defense. I don't know. It's not a good legal defense, considering that Alex Jones just got sued for $1 bazillion. And his entire legal defense, his main defense was, Alex Jones is a character. I play for an entertainment show called InfoWars. Okay, he was claiming it to be fiction, claiming it to be a bit, and he still got his pants sued off. And I even think that the stuff that he got in trouble for talking about has some credibility to it, right? It's wild to me that they made an example of him for that thing, of all the different things he's talked about. And so we have to ask ourselves, does John Levi, does Lucius Aurelian, does the Tartaria Vault or whatever it was called, do they see themselves as entertainment? Do they see themselves as playing a character? Is it actually a bit? Or is there some other reason why they would feel the need to put that on their description? Help me out here. Answer this for me. Why would you put entertainment purposes only if you thought you were telling the truth? You wouldn't. If you were just idly speculating, if you were just part of a genre that's a copy-paste template that they all do the same dumb questions, the same show some pictures and never get into the evidence again and again and again for this building and that building, if that's your whole model and you've seen it work, other channels do well doing it, so now you do it and you just copy the same description off of their YouTube channel and everything before you get going, I mean, guys, this is not authentic. There's nothing authentic about this. And I think this is going to apply to any other part of the Tartaria reset theory that I happen to look at. And again, why did I do the asylum topic twice? Why did I go into it harder and further and even present more stuff that is potentially questionable than these guys ever brought up themselves? Is because if you can knock down the pillar of the Tartaria reset theory that says these asylums were for everybody that remembered the old world, and we just chucked them in these asylums and exterminated them. Well, that's not true. Provably not true. So how did they deal with the people that remembered the old world then? I have never seen any other adequate explanation. Not that that was an adequate one at all, the asylum explanation. So I'm just really amazed. I'm just really amazed at the grift of this shit. And so it gets me fired up, okay? I have to be honest about that. It annoys me when easily disproven stuff is the popular stuff. And of course, that's the world. That's how it's always been. But don't fall for it. Don't fall for this anymore. Don't let the fact that there are so many actually true conspiracies and dark things in the world that you've looked into and they wound up being accurate. Don't let that become your primary fallen worldview, such that anything that is presented that's contrarian, that has a they're doing it to you, they're doing it to us type of narrative behind it, that you just take that as automatically it must be true because it aligns with all my entire worldview, which is that paranoia worldview, essentially. So don't do that. I'm trying to help. I used to do that. I don't want to do that anymore. Just because it's contrarian and goes against the popular belief does not make it accurate, okay? Lots of times the popular belief is ass backwards. No doubt about it. But don't be like the normies and just take a dogma from your subculture instead of from the larger culture and believe it like a religion because of the fact that you have some kind of like social connection to other people who are also contrarian against the mainstream. So you all just go with this dogma together and don't even understand you're doing the exact same thing that the normies do. I'm not trying to lecture you. This is just for all of us to think twice about what we accept into our worldview. I accepted Tartaria into my worldview, okay? I accepted the old world reset into my worldview. And you know what? It's a much nicer worldview to think that my recent ancestors, our recent ancestors in the United States actually could build this stuff. And it's also a more painful one when you realize how much we've lost in skill, in craftsmanship, in care, in beauty, in adornment, artistry, in permanency, in just overall seriousness of how we consider our purpose here in life and like what we're here to do, right? It's all become so frivolous and so throwaway and so fast food. It is bullshit, right? But it's our people that did this not very long ago, not some East Asian barbarian Mongolians that somehow had a world-spanning empire. I'm just done with it. So you might see me go at some of the other pillars of this in the future if I feel like it, but maybe not. Because to me, I've just looked and looked and looked again. The reason I looked at this Lucius Aurelian guy today and this specific video is because it was presented to me as the good material on the subject. And guess what? It was no better than anything else I've looked at. No proof was shown. No evidence was given. It was just, look at this photo. Super sus, right? I'm not saying that it's this, but, you know, I am saying that. Like, there's just nothing of substance. So that's what I want to get off my chest about it. And I've been immersed in this topic for like 3 or 4 weeks. I'm very excited to be done with the asylum topic. It was a lot of work. I hope you'll find something about it that's useful. I hope that you might even consider supporting me for what I put out here, because at this point, it's painful in a lot of ways because I have to go against many of my own friends, many of my own audience. And I don't mean to go against, I'm with you guys, but I'm seen as against everybody because I'm not getting with the dogma that the conspiracy subculture has taken on as the truth. And I will be that guy. I'm happy to be that guy because I actually want to know the truth. So I'll say it again. If there are any good pieces of evidence for old world buildings, repurposed, refurbished, whatever, show me the money, okay? Because nobody has shown me a damn thing. Everything I've looked at that's been sent to me, and I've looked at all of it that I possibly could. I've been obsessive about this, much more than what I've been able to put into this one presentation that I had to keep on one topic, okay? There's nothing there, okay? There's nothing there. And the most interesting part about it is the fact that our own people actually could do this. And time again, document after document, photo after photo, technology after technology, whatever the case, everything I've looked at, it all points to the same thing. 19th century America and 19th century Victorian British Empire were fucking legends. They were getting it done. I would like to see that come back. But if we don't even believe that our own people, our own ancestors were good enough to do that stuff, when will it ever come back? It starts with healing our worldview. It starts with remembering who we are. We were the people that did this. I didn't do it, but my ancestors did and yours did. That means it's in us somewhere, not in some erased, invisible, anonymous precursor civilization. Okay, I'm just ranting at this point. I really appreciate you guys that listened all the way to this point. And, you know, I've never done anything quite like this by myself before. And there was a lot about it that I enjoyed. And I felt like I got a lot of growth out of it. And thanks for coming along with me. I'll catch you guys on the next one. Thank you for listening to Inner World. To unlock the second half of this episode and access the entire archive of our research, join Interverse Plus or become a supporter on Dylan's Substack. Find links to all the ways you can join at interverseplus.com.